All right, welcome back to another episode of Whiskey University with Jay Bradley from the Craft Whiskey Boys. We're going to talk today about bourbon versus Scotch. So here's the thing, bourbon has to have a mash bill of at least 51% corn, whereas in Scotland, to be called a single malt whiskey, it needs to be 100% malted barley. Malted barley is a completely different flavor profile than what corn would be, which is sweeter. Now, in this bourbon mash bill, you will get a bit of malted barley in there, you'll get a bit of rye. That goes in there, but 51% must be corn. Now, Scottish whiskey traditionally double distills, not always, as I said on some of the other videos, but traditionally they double distill. Whereas bourbon is used on multi-stills, so they use a continuous still or a patent still, or what initially was called the coffee still, made by Annius Coffee, is an Irish guy from Drogheda, invented that still. And it's a still that will basically distill a spirit continuously, and it will distill it right up into nearly 98% proof. Now in Scotland, they only allow it to go up to 94.8%, which is still nearly pure ethanol. The law in bourbon is they can only distill it up to 80%. The reason why bourbon put a law that you can only bring it up to 80% is because when you distill it past there, you lose a lot of the flavor, which is why kind of that cheaper blended grain whiskey distills super high, because they're trying to get that flavorless and just blend. It's like a blended product, nearly like a vodka, so to speak. So that's one of the things here. Bourbon must be in virgin oak, and it must be charred on the inside. And there's a reason for that. People think they must char it on the inside the barrel because it gives flavor to the bourbon and it's distinct, and that's why it must be charred, and that's not true. The reason why a virgin oak barrel must be charred on the inside to be legally called bourbon afterwards is because back in the day when whiskey was being made, there was the techniques weren't perfected back in the 1700s and the 1800s, and when whiskey comes off a still, you get these fusel oils, these congeners, these things that can send you blind, make you sick, and even kill you. And if it's sat for at least 3 years, for example, in that charred oak, then that would, I guess, purify some of those things and pull them out. Unfortunately, bourbon doesn't legally have to be 3 years old like it does in Scotland or it does in Ireland. Ireland and Scotland are very similar in that they both have to be 3 years old to be legally called Irish or Scotch whiskey, and they must, or Scottish whiskey should I say, and they must be made in their respective countries. Bourbon must be made in America too, but it doesn't have to be 3 years old. It doesn't even have to be 2 years old. It can be 3 months old. It can be 15 minutes old to be called bourbon. To be called straight bourbon, it must be at least 2 years old. So again, there's no age, but in straight bourbon, it must be at least 2 years old. It must be 51% corn. It must be in a virgin oak barrel. And what tends to happen to those virgin oak barrels when they're finished, because they can't reuse them, is they send them over to Scotland, they send them over to Ireland, and then we mature our whiskey in there. That's what we call a first fill ex-bourbon barrel. It's a great barrel to be able to mature whiskey in. Phenomenal for Irish and Scotland, and it works out great for these guys too. Bourbon is made predominantly in Kentucky, but it's made in a lot of other areas. It doesn't have to be made in Kentucky, but in Kentucky it is a lot warmer specifically than in Scotland. So the age of this will mature much faster than in Scotland. Now let's just talk a little bit about flavors, right? So bourbon is traditionally a lot sweeter and a lot oakier, because number one, it's going into a virgin charred oak barrel, and it's specifically straight bourbon. It's got to sit in there for at least 2 years, but a lot of the time, because you don't see an age statement on the bottle, that means it's more than 4 years old, sometimes a lot older. They will put it on if they want to, but they legally don't have to once it's above 4 years old. If it's below 4 years old, they've got to tell you how old it is. So bourbon is going to be done in a warmer climate, so it's going to mature faster, much sweeter, much oakier, given because of that charred virgin oak. Scottish whiskey is going to be much better when it's older, way more complex, way more full-bodied, creamier on the mouthfeel. The older it gets, the better it gets. Unfortunately for bourbon, when bourbon starts to get past like 15 years old, even past 12 years old, in my opinion, some people will argue, some people love a 23-year-old Pappy Van Winkle. I don't. I think it's just way too oaky and leathery. It's just got so much of the barrel, because it's sitting down in Kentucky and it's in that virgin oak barrel for all of those years. It's like drinking, you know, a glass of the wooden barrel with some sweetness to it, in my opinion. Not everybody will agree with that, and that's okay. But I think that bourbon doesn't get much better when it's past 10 years old, 12 years old. I think it's perfect. That Scottish whiskey gets phenomenal because it's in a colder climate, because it's the double distillation and the malt. The malt doesn't have that sweetness. Traditionally, it has sweetness, don't get me wrong, because it is got sugars and starches that happen when barley gets malted, but it's not as sweet as this. As it gets older, it gets more rounded, more complex. It's phenomenal drinking when it gets older, Scottish whiskey. This is great drinking when it's younger, and not massively younger, but around that 10, 12-year-old mark. It's a beautiful drinking drop. But unfortunately, there's a lot of bourbon there that it kind of is just that run-of-the-mill, stick it with a Coke, or whatever you want to mix it with, put it in a cocktail. It's again, in a cocktail, oh my God, you can't make a good old-fashioned without it. I make a good old-fashioned with a nice peaty Scotch as well, but bourbon is the king of old-fashions, of whiskey sours, of so many great cocktails. Mint julep were probably one of my favorites. And those cocktails were made back in the day because, little history lesson here, I guess, cocktails initially got invented when moonshiners were making whiskey that was just unpalatable to drink, but people still wanted to get drunk. So they started to add some sugar and some other things to it. And that's effectively when this moonshine, which is basically bourbon made in the hills that hasn't been aged or followed any of the rules of bourbon, they started mixing it with all this like sugar syrups, and they put some mint leaves in it, and eventually all these cocktails got invented, and that all kind of happened over in the US, and it's phenomenal for that. So young bourbon, even if it's 2 or 3 or 4 years old, is great for cocktails. As it gets past about 4 or 5 years old, it's really good sipping whiskey. To sit there and have a bourbon on ice, oh, it's amazing. To sit there, I don't drink Scotch on ice. I do with bourbon, not always, but I do more so with a bourbon. If it gets past about 10 or 12 years old, it's just a couple of drops of water for me on bourbon. When I get onto Scotch, it's always just neat, a couple of drops of water to open it up, release the micelles. Much like with wine, you want to let an old wine breathe when it comes out of the bottle. Well, Scottish whiskey or Irish whiskey or even older bourbon, it's been sitting in the bottle for so long as well, and the micelles kind of tighten up. When you drop a few drops of water in there, it releases them, releases the flavor profiles. It's not a weak move to put a bit of water with whiskey. You absolutely should add some water to whiskey. I can do a whole other video on that. I won't go into it now, but a few drops, 100%. If it's a cask strength, even more. And that's it. Let me just break it down one last time. Bourbon, made in America, made 51% corn, sweeter, oakier, virgin oak barrel. They can never use the barrel again, so once it comes out, they got to discard the barrel. They send it over to Scotland. Older, double distilled whiskey, traditionally made with 100% malted barley. Has to be made in an oak barrel, but doesn't have to be virgin oak like in bourbon. Colder climate, so it takes a bit longer to mature. Warmer climate, matures faster. And yeah, of course, this has to be at least 3 years old. This doesn't unless it's straight bourbon, and then it has to be at least 2 years old. But that's okay. 2 years old is enough for bourbon because it is a warmer climate. So both of them, I love both of them. I'm a massive fan of both. If you haven't tried either, try both. Scotland, go at least above 16 years old. Bourbon, try and aim for around an 8 to 12-year-old. That's my opinion. Comment below, let me know what you think. Subscribe, hit the bell so you get notifications when I have another video, and I'll catch you on the next Whiskey University.